Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 114, and welcome to the final two lectures in the course. Here in this lecture, we're going to begin our study of the third and final phase of Reconstruction, the period known as the retreat from Reconstruction. This is a period where, as we'll see, the promise and hopes that were so alive in the period of Reconstruction where the radical Republicans were in charge, when they were ratifying the 14th and 15th Amendments, changing America in a revolutionary way that I hope you can now understand and appreciate, how after that, in the 1870s, the three branches of the federal government will turn their backs on really making America a nation of equality and freedom for all. As I've stressed, in order for civil rights to go forward, whether it is the Reconstruction period, the modern civil rights movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, you need the federal government. You need the federal government to force states and individuals to do what they're not inclined to do. As we'll see in these final two lectures, sadly, tragically, in the 1870s, the federal government will fail to enforce equality and freedom for all. And as a result, when Reconstruction ends in 1877, the nation would devolve into another 100 years of inequality, discrimination, racism, until that second Reconstruction of the 1950s and 1960s. And as we examine this final phase of Reconstruction, the retreat from Reconstruction, document what happens, we can truly appreciate how Reconstruction can be understood as a tragic era. That idea of Reconstruction as a tragic era in its modern formulation is the idea that in this moment, when we were indeed hitting the reset button, reimagining the nation, we fail to become a nation of equality and freedom for all. That notion of a tragic era is deeply informed by what we've examined most recently, radical Reconstruction, where there was great hope, great promise, and true opportunities as a result of the efforts of the radical Republicans. Unfortunately, tragically, as we'll see here, that moment will be a brief one, and in the 1870s, the three branches of the federal government will turn their backs on Reconstruction, and the nation will indeed become a nation of inequality, when the peace will prevail, making Reconstruction truly a tragic era. One factor in the overthrow of radical Reconstruction, a failure within the executive branch, the presidency. In 1868, Ulysses S. Grant wins the presidency, a general, a war hero, a man who helped the United States, the Union, win in the Civil War, will earn the nomination in 1868, largely because the radical Republicans approved of him as he was an ally of their vision of change. And in his first term in office, as we'll talk about here, between 1869 and 1873, Grant is very, very effective in continuing the efforts of the radical Republicans. He will help shepherd through and see the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which gave black men the right to vote. As we'll talk about in this lecture, in his first term, he was very successful in warring against the first iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. He declared them what they were, a terrorist organization, a threat to law and order. He called out the army, and he incarcerated their leaders and scared the hell out of those who weren't arrested so that they went underground. But in his second term, having been reelected in 1872, Grant, and with it the executive branch, would fail to continue the efforts of equality and freedom for all. Part of this stemmed from a series of scandals that rocked the Grant administration in its second term, including the whiskey ring scandal, where members of Grant's cabinet were implicated in a variety of forms of corruption. Now, Grant himself, the president, was never implicated in any of these scandals. And scholars, historians examining the Grant administration in the decades that followed its end through today agree that Grant was not culpable, not guilty of any of the malfeasance that surrounded him. But members of his cabinet were removed because they were involved in scandals like the whiskey ring scandal, where they were caught taking bribes from distillers, from producers of whiskey and other alcoholic beverages. It's important to note that in the 19th century, there was no income tax. As I mentioned earlier in the class, during the Civil War, Lincoln did establish briefly an income tax, but after the war, when that funding was no longer needed, he ended the income tax. Instead, in the 19th century, the federal government relied on land sales for income and revenue, land that they took from Native Americans in the aggressive Indian wars of this period. That too is one of the tragic elements of Reconstruction. As soon as the Civil War ends, we begin once again warring against Native Americans to dispossess them of their land that was later sold to mining operations, corporations, individuals. So the federal government relied on revenue that came from those land sales, as well as taxes on alcohol. There's a reason why, just before Prohibition in the early 20th century, we established an income tax, because we needed revenue when in the 1920s we foolishly and catastrophically ended the sale of alcohol during Prohibition. In the 19th century, taxes on alcohol, along with land sales, were the major source of revenue for the federal government. So there's a deep connection between the federal government and this industry, the whiskey industry, the distilling, brewing industries, and a lot of the leaders in that industry bribed members of the Grant administration. And so there were a series of scandals that rocked the Grant administration in its second term. And this is important in the story of the retreat from Reconstruction, the overthrow of radical Reconstruction, because as I have stressed already in this lecture, stressed in our previous lectures on Reconstruction, and really in order for you to really understand the totality of American history, in order for civil rights to go forward, you need the federal government. You need an interventionist government. The story of civil rights, whether it is Reconstruction or the second Reconstruction of the 20th century or efforts today, the story of civil rights is not the story of one day every white person waking up in America and saying, you know what, blacks and whites, Latinos and whites, Asian Americans and whites should be equal. It's not how it happens. It happens from the federal government forcing states and individuals to do what they're not inclined to do. We've seen that with the 14th, 15th Amendment, the Reconstruction Act. The South was determined to prevent equality for emancipated African Americans. And the North was complicit in that early in Reconstruction under the phase of presidential Reconstruction. In the second Reconstruction of the modern civil rights movement, that change comes not by a change in hearts and minds and attitudes where one day every white person gets woke, right? It comes from Supreme Court decisions like Brown v. Board of Education. It comes from federal legislation like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act. So civil rights only goes forward when you have big government, when you have an interventionist federal government looking out for vulnerable minorities, protecting them. And when the Grant administration was rocked by scandals, people saw their government as corrupt. And as a result, they didn't want more government. They didn't want their government doing more. They didn't want their government in an interventionist role because they saw the Grant administration as a den of thieves. So one of the factors within the executive branch that leads to this retreat from Reconstruction, the myriad of scandals that rocked the Grant administration, the corruption, which really declined public support for a more interventionist role by the federal government. So that was a major problem for continuing to use the federal government to protect voting rights, personal rights of vulnerable African Americans in the South. And then another major problem in the second term for Grant, after he was reelected in 1872, a massive economic depression, the Panic of 1873. I made this point before in the class. In the 19th century, there are these bust periods in the very volatile boom and bust economy of the 1800s. There are these panics, as they are known. Early in the class, we talked about the Panic of 1837. We talked about a major economic downturn in 1857 that was key in building support for the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision. Well, there's another massive economic depression in this volatile boom and bust economy of the 19th century in 1873, a year after Grant had been reelected. And what this did was it really also declined support for the federal government intervening in the South to protect African Americans. Instead, the American public, particularly Northerners, said, look, we've got this huge economic crisis. The federal government should do more to right this economic concern and problem, to revive the economy, to invest in efforts that will restore economic opportunity. When the Panic of 1873 descended, that became the major focus of energy, attention in the nation, and it led to an ebbing of support for using the federal government to protect African Americans. Whites in the North said, why are we so worried about whether or not blacks can vote in Alabama when we have all these economic problems? Coupled with this was the fact that the Republican Party of the 1870s was the party more inclined to levy taxes for things like investment in infrastructure, building railroads, maintaining a public school system. And when the Panic of 1873 strikes, people are seeing their wages decline. They're seeing their family budgets under great stress. And so the party that says, hey, we're going to tax you so we can invest in railroads is out of favor because people don't want to pay taxes when they're losing their jobs, when they're seeing these declining fortunes. The Republican Party is the heir to what was once a Federalist Party platform and principle, and then later the Whigs. The Republican Party in the 1870s was a party that said, hey, let's levy taxes and use that revenue to invest in infrastructure, in public institutions. This is before a shift in the Republican Party by the late 19th and early 20th century, when it becomes the party that is a party of lower taxes, deregulation, a party of big business. In the late 1800s, the Republican Party that emerged in the 1850s as the party of the little guy, the common man, trying to create economic opportunity for the little guy, in its efforts to stop the expansion of slavery in the West, that same Republican Party 40 years later by the 1890s is the party of big business. And as a result, it will jettison its strong support prior for things like taxes, public investment. But in the 1870s, it was still the party that made that argument. But in the Panic of 1873, that is not a winning argument because people don't want higher taxes. They want lower taxes because they are facing economic insecurity and potential unemployment. So all of this serves to turn voters against the Republican Party, and that is ultimately a tragedy for African Americans because the only party that can successfully lobby for protections, rights, freedoms for African Americans is the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is party of the South, party of win the peace, party of ex-Confederates. So when the Republican Party declines in support, when, as we'll talk about in this lecture, they lose the midterm elections of 1874, when it looks like they're going to lose the presidency in 1876, that's bad for African Americans who need the Republican Party. So there are these cluster factors here, particularly in Grant's second term. Remember, in Grant's first term, he's really good in the cause of radical Reconstruction. But in his second term, scandals, an economic downturn, and the way in which that turns many voters against the Republican Party means that it's less and less possible for the Grant administration to do what is necessary, use the federal government to protect vulnerable minorities, because civil rights only goes forward when the federal government does more. So in this first slide, we're introduced to one of the key factors that help us understand how we go from radical Reconstruction, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, former slaves elected to the U.S. Congress, to where we will be when Reconstruction ends, a nation separate and unequal. One early factor enunciated on this first slide, the failures of the executive branch in Grant's second term. Another factor in explaining the retreat from Reconstruction, the failures of this era, how it becomes a tragic era, is simply the willingness of whites in the South to use violence, terrorism, extra-legal means in their goal of win the peace. Win the peace, again, was the abiding goal of ex-Confederates, whites in the South, maintaining what slavery allowed for in a post-slavery America, keeping blacks and whites separate, denying rights, power, and privileges to African Americans, and protecting rights, power, and privileges for whites and whites only. That was accomplished in presidential Reconstruction, but boom, then you got radical Reconstruction. And when the radical Republicans are in charge of the national government, when they are occupying the South, when the 14th and 15th Amendments are ratified, when the legal means of maintaining white supremacy are slipping away, in the late 1860s, early 1870s, whites in the South use extra legal, outside the law means to hold on to white supremacy. So another factor is the dogged effort of whites to refuse radical Reconstruction and use violence, terrorism to maintain that win the peace ideal. They could not accept an America where African Americans were citizens and voters. In many parts of the South, African Americans were the majority, particularly in the Deep South, in the areas that had once been the heart of the Cotton Kingdom. That's why in those locations, African Americans are elected to the U.S. Congress because they're the majority. And so radical Reconstruction is a world turned upside down. It's about racial equality. It's about empowering African Americans. For Southerners, when they see that manifesting, when they are living through radical Reconstruction, where the political force in America is being employed by Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, the radical Republicans, whites do their best to use violence and terrorism to overturn the political order, to restore that Southern way of life that was invested in maintaining rights, power, and privileges for whites and whites only. And when the federal government is being directed and advanced by the radical Republicans, when the radical Republicans are at the apex of their power, they're impeaching Andrew Johnson, they are ratifying the 14th Amendment, whites in the South say, well, we can't use legal means to achieve what we are going to achieve because now laws are being written and advanced by the radical Republicans, the people who are architects of black emancipation and empowerment. And so Southerners say, we'll just simply use illegal means to maintain white supremacy. And so this too is a factor in the story of the retreat from Reconstruction, the unrepentance of the South, their unwillingness to accept defeat, change, and a new America, reborn, resurrected, where blacks and whites are equal. They are not going to accept that, and they're willing to use any means to achieve that. We see the same thing in the second Reconstruction of the modern civil rights movement. This absolute defiance, this willingness to use violence in the 1950s, 1960s. People are beaten, killed. Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, Dr. King, because they dared to attempt to advance equality and freedom for all. I've said this many times that civil rights only goes forward and the federal government does more. That's because it isn't a story of changing attitudes. And further evidence of this is the absolute willingness of people to employ violence to maintain white supremacy. What did it take to end slavery? People didn't one day see it as evil and seek to end it. It took a bloody, ruinous civil war that took the lives of over 600,000 people. That's what it took. You saw that photograph earlier in the class of Richmond, where Southerners dug in their heels and fought, and the entire city was destroyed because they could not accept the prospects of ending slavery. Even when slavery is abolished, they're still killing people. Lincoln, assassinated by Booth. And then, flash forward 100 years later, and you have the violence in Selma and Birmingham. You have John Lewis's skull being fractured because he wanted to be able to vote. The history of the efforts of racial justice in this country, unfortunately, involve violence. Do not believe the nonsense that you may hear today about how, well, in the 60s it was nonviolent protests that changed America. It's true, Dr. King and many employed nonviolent tactics, but they were met with violence. When African Americans marched in the streets for change employing nonviolence, they were beaten and killed. Violence occurred in the civil rights era. And so, sadly, tragically, what we can see now as we look at this period is that violence is being used in these periods in American history, Reconstruction, the 20th and now 21st century, to hold on to white supremacy. These are violent times in America in the 1870s when violence is employed to this end. Originally, the form of violence that you see erupting in the post-Civil War South is very unorganized, it's random, it's spontaneous. You have these violent explosions in the ex-Confederacy when it is forced into surrender and slaves are emancipated. There are all these incidences in really the months and really weeks after the fall of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox where white Southerners are beating and killing African Americans. I've mentioned earlier that image of the bloody shirt that Thaddeus Stevens would wave from the floor of the U.S. House. That shirt, bloodied, was worn by a white reformer who headed down south to try to help African Americans transition from slavery to freedom, set up schools. And he was beaten by a white mob who could not accept those prospects. So initially, right after Appomattox, there are these spontaneous ad hoc forms of violence. But after 1867, when the radical Republicans take control, and white Southerners are now seeing the 14th Amendment ratified, they're seeing their states occupied by the federal government, they are often denied voting rights while blacks are securing voter rights. Well, then the violence becomes more pervasive and more political. I've used this term, and it's a very precise term. Terrorism. This is terrorism. Terrorism is more than just scaring people, using violence, doing dramatic violent acts. Terrorism is violence for political ends. It's about achieving something politically through violence. Achieving something politically through violence that you cannot achieve through the legitimate channels of power. In Reconstruction, the legitimate channels of power are being employed and utilized by the radical Republicans to change America. And when that happens, white Southerners move outside the legitimate channels of power and use violence, terrorism, to hold on to their political goal, their political end of white supremacy. So what began as spontaneous, ad hoc, without a political agenda, by 1867 does become much more organized, much more concerted, and much more political in its efforts to override radical Reconstruction. This is another causal factor in, again, what ultimately is the tragic era of Reconstruction, a causal factor in the period we're examining now, this retreat from Reconstruction. One of the best known and most important consequential elements of this is the Ku Klux Klan, which was founded almost immediately after the Civil War by ex-Confederate soldiers, first in Tennessee, and then chapters were formed in every southern state in the early period of Reconstruction. It was founded by ex-Confederates who feared the prospects of blacks equal under law, blacks as voters, people who could not accept that radical change that in radical Reconstruction was materializing. The Klan was made up of people from different walks of life, different class backgrounds in the South. The majority were subsistence farmers, poor whites. The class of Southerners that we've examined a great deal in this class, who before the Civil War were not slaveholders, but felt in league with and solidarity through bonds of racism with the planter elite. And they're the people who we talked a lot about in the middle part of the class who form the ranks of the Confederate Army, the vast majority of which don't own slaves, have no prospects of ever owning slaves, but were willing to fight and die for the values associated with slavery. But also joining the Klan were the wealthy planters, the former slaveholders, the leaders of the Confederate government and movement, prominent members in Southern politics, both before and after the Civil War, even members of the clergy who would couch this supremacy, this effort of white supremacy in religious terms. We talked a lot earlier in the class about how religion was used to support slavery, support white supremacy, the biblical arguments for the legitimacy of slavery, how Southerners saw slavery as moral. In fact, they saw their society as the most moral society on earth. Well, that doesn't end when slavery ends. After the Civil War, religion would be used to justify white supremacy, segregation, violence against African Americans. So the clergy were often very active. And the point I'm making here is that this is very demonstrative of win the peace. Win the peace, again, is maintaining all that slavery allowed for in a post-slavery South. What we have here with groups like the Klan is an effort to forge anew the bonds of racism and white male solidarity. All right, we talked a lot earlier in the class about the origins of a slave society and that element of white male solidarity. We talked a lot about how, though the majority of whites in the South prior to the Civil War don't own slaves, they felt a kinship, a connection through cultural and social values, paternalism, racism, with the planter elite. We talked a lot about how that would urge them to fill the ranks of the Confederate Army. But during the course of the Civil War, as we examined in our final lectures on the war period, we saw those class tensions flare and solidarities unravel. We saw how white Southerners became convinced that they were fighting for the interest of a few. In order to win the peace, in order to maintain white supremacy, you need to reestablish those bonds of solidarity. And that's what happens in the Reconstruction period and for decades after Reconstruction. There is this concerted and deliberate effort by power brokers in the South, the landowners, the politicians, the clergymen, the leaders of political, economic, and social capital to reestablish close ties with the majority of poor subsistence farmers in the South, to reestablish that sense of solidarity in a now post-slavery South, and groups like the Klan were key to that. The Klan attacked African Americans. Every black body in the Reconstruction South had to fear that at any moment it could be seized by whites who could intervene and beat, rape, kill African Americans. But again, this is not simply racial violence. This isn't just violence because I hate you because of the color of your skin. This is political violence. Do not simply understand the Klan as a bunch of white Southerners who are racist who couldn't accept their defeat. That's part of it, certainly. But it's also a political effort, an effort to use violence for political ends. Every black person in the South had to fear the Klan because at any moment their body could be intervened upon. They could be beaten, attacked, raped, lynched. But the African Americans who were most likely to incur violence were African Americans who were active in politics. So the violence is not random. It is targeted. It is targeted at African Americans who served as politicians, who attempted to secure land, who voted, intended to vote, registered to vote, who refused to accept second-class status, who were seen as unwilling to accept white supremacy, who were charged with defying social norms invested in maintaining white supremacy, African Americans who went step aside and let a white person pass, African Americans who attempted to live as free people. We talked in our first lecture on Reconstruction about all the different ways African Americans envisioned freedom. Freedom meant land ownership, it meant voting rights, it meant control of one's body, one's family, it meant mobility, the chance to move and be free in that sense. Any African American who tried to exercise those freedoms invited the wrath of the Klan, particularly those African Americans who exercised things like political or claims to economic freedom, demonstrative here of, again, how the Klan was a political movement. And further evidence of this is that they targeted whites. They targeted not just African Americans, but whites in the Reconstruction South, white Republicans who were associated with that party of the radical Republicans and their prescription of change. They targeted Northerners who headed down south and established schools and other opportunities for African Americans. They were often called carpetbaggers. This was the term that Southerners used for Northerners who headed down south, and the term was a pejorative. Carpetbagger, I don't know, that probably doesn't sound like it's much of an insult to you today. It doesn't have much venom behind it, but it was a pejorative. It was an insult. It meant that you were an opportunist in the eyes of Southerners. You're coming and taking advantage of a weakened, defeated South and foisting upon it black literacy, black learning, black political participation. So white Northerners who headed down south, who were charged with being carpetbaggers, were targeted. And they too were executed, beaten, intimidated by the Klan. So it isn't just African Americans who are being targeted, because again, the Klan isn't merely a racist organization. It certainly is, but it's a racist political organization. It's a racist organization attempting to achieve the political goal of white supremacy and win the peace. It's hard to overstate its willingness to use violence, terrorism, its willingness to execute, kill people. The Klan was an effort to use these extra legal means to achieve what could not be achieved during radical Reconstruction through formal legal means. And every form of violence was employed to this end. So another factor in the retreat from Reconstruction, the way in which Southerners, when political power slips away from them, employ violence and terrorism to hold on to white supremacy. One other way in which you can see the Klan as this effort to maintain the slave society in a post-slavery South is in relation to gender. I mentioned that the Klan was this effort to reestablish, rekindle bonds of affection among all white men in the South, to smooth over class divisions and maintain white male solidarities that prevailed in the antebellum period, the slave society prior to the Civil War. Well, one of the big sources of solidarity and connection among white men in the South was a sense of gender ideologies. One, paternalism, which said white men should be in charge of their families and society, and so all white men could embrace that notion of certain powers and privileges associated with being white men. But there was also a way in which ideas about femininity were key to those social solidarities of the antebellum South, and they continue on here in the Reconstruction period. Every chapter of the Klan had a woman's auxiliary, a part of the chapter comprised of wives of Klan members, and they provided a support role. They would cook for Klan meetings. They sewed the robes that were used by the Klan in their ceremonies and performances of racialized violence like cross burnings. So part of what the Women's Auxiliary did was complement and support through these labors the efforts of the Klan. But there's a symbolic element here too, which is vital to how the Klan maintained solidarities among white men through gender ideologies. The place of women in the Klan was a way of reinforcing the notion of white maleness as the protector of women in a way that's very similar in continuity with paternalism as it worked in the slave society we learned about very early in the class. Paternalism was the idea white men have all the power and privileges, but they also have responsibilities to care for their dependents, people who can never be independent. And that included women. And we talked a lot about how that was really important in building support for slavery, where white men who don't own slaves want to own slaves so that they could free their wives from the drudgery of farm labor and be good paternal figures. I'm protecting my wife. I'm protecting my wife by owning slaves. And then also how this idea of vulnerable women, that notion of femininity, also built support for slavery because there was this fear of escaped slaves as potential rapists and violators of your wife and daughter. Well, that activates here in a now post-slavery South in this role that women played in the Klan as, again, as they were imagined to be protected by the white male members of society. There is this terrible and sadly ongoing racist motif in America of the libidinous black male, the sexualized black male. This comes out of a long tradition. It's certainly reinforced in the period we're examining this class in the 19th century through all kinds of iconography, minstrel shows. This idea that black men are potential rapists. And we all know that, terribly tragically, that vision is still with us. It's still articulated and expressed in our public, political, and popular culture. It's one of the terrible legacies of racism. And it certainly was active in this period, when black men have been emancipated through the end of slavery and now face the prospects of opportunity and freedom. With it comes this fear that, well, they're going to rape your daughter. They're going to rape your wife. And that was very important here in the Klan and the relationship between women and men in the Klan. This idea that we're white men, we have to protect white womanhood. I mentioned very early in this class the first formulation of the tragic era, this idea that Reconstruction was tragic because whites were victimized. Whites had to accept black equality. And one of the most important expressions of that was that film, Birth of a Nation, based on the novel The Klansman, released in 1915, the very first movie ever screened at the White House. There are many scenes in Birth of a Nation which represent black men as rapists, as potential violators of white womanhood. There's a scene in Birth of a Nation where when black men are voters and elected to state houses, they pass laws where now they can marry white women. And there are all these scenes of black men, some of them white actors in blackface, lusting over white women. And so the role of women in the Klan was crucial, not just in sewing robes and cooking for their meetings, in symbolizing that idea of vulnerable white women who must be protected from black men. And that was another key motivation in the violence against black men. So many black men who are lynched are castrated. There's always a sexualized element of racism. It's never just about race. It's always connected to sex. And so this was very key in the racialized violence the Klan wrought for decades. But it was also key in building the sense that we're white men. We all have something in common, whether we're rich or poor. It was very common in building that solidarity, this idea that we all have to protect white women. So the role of women in the Klan is crucial in the way in which it furthered racialized violence and also furthered these solidarities based on race. A couple of images here to complement what we're talking about in terms of the Klan and violence, terrorism. On the left, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Confederate officer. He is responsible for one of the great wartime atrocities in American history, the Fort Pillow Massacre, where African-American soldiers who surrendered to Forrest's army were summarily executed. Nathan Bedford Forrest would go on after the Civil War. He is not punished for Fort Pillow. He's not arrested. He's not executed. He lives on. And he helps form the Klan. He's one of the founding fathers of the Klan. Today there's a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest in the state capital of Tennessee. There is a state park in Tennessee named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. Up until very, very recently, just a few years ago, there was a public elementary school in Florida named after Nathan Bedford Forrest. One, a secessionist. Two, a traitor to this nation who took up arms against this nation to perpetuate slavery. A slave owner himself, a white supremacist, a man responsible for the Fort Pillow Massacre, and a founding father of the Ku Klux Klan. And as I speak right now in the 21st century, there are efforts by the state legislature in Tennessee to keep his bust, to keep his statue still in the state capitol. He gets a bust, he gets a statue, he gets a monument, he gets a state park. Where are all the monuments to the black soldiers who fought for this country and fought for freedom? On the right, a political cartoon which speaks to, again, the way in which the Klan was a political organization that targeted whites. It's tough to read here, but the slogan or the tagline here is a prospective scene in the city of Oaks on a certain date, Oaks, Mississippi. And what you see here is that two white men from Ohio, carpetbaggers, see, they're carrying their bag, are being hung by the Klan. They have white faces. the idea here is that this is what happens to whites who come from the North and try to impose opportunity and equality for African Americans on white society. They will be hung. So this was intimidation. This was a statement to any white person in Oaks, Mississippi who dares to try to advance the cause of black equality. You too will incur the wrath, in this case, of execution from the Klan. There are incidences of mass terrorism in this country in the Reconstruction period, mass violence. There's the Meridian Massacre of 1871, where the Klan executes over 30 African Americans, kills a white Republican judge in the Meridian race riot, where the Klan barge into a court of law where a trial is being held and shoot in the chest, right there when he's sitting on the bench, this white Republican judge, because they feared he would be too friendly to the black man who was subject to the trial taking place. A black man was charged with a crime. Ironically, it was a crime against speech that was designed to stamp out the Klan. Meridian, Mississippi had passed a law forbidding certain forms of expression in speech that were thought to incite racialized violence. Well, tellingly, the very first person charged under this law wasn't a Klansman, was an African American. And he was put on trial, and the Klan thought, well, this guy's going to get off. He's going to be exonerated because the judge was a Republican who was favorable to African Americans. So to prevent the trial from going forward and the potential exoneration of this African American, they barge into the courtroom and they fire right there in the middle of the court into the chest of this Republican. And then that inspired whites throughout Meridian, Mississippi, to attack and kill any random black person they encountered. Terrorism, violence. Perhaps the best known of the incidences of mass violence that occurred in the Reconstruction period was the Colfax Massacre, which occurred in Louisiana in 1873. An election was held in that part of Louisiana, in the Colfax County of Louisiana. The election was considered fraudulent because so many African Americans were prevented from voting. To seek redress, they went to the seat of the county, a courthouse in Colfax, and they demanded that a revote be held so that their votes would be counted and all African Americans would be able to vote. So we're talking about African Americans voting. We're talking about them accessing institutions of power, seeking redress. When they amassed at the courthouse, a group of Klansmen and white supremacists amassed outside the courthouse. They set fire to the courthouse, hoping that African Americans would have to flee when the building was on fire. After they set fire, African Americans ran for their lives, and as they did so, they were mowed down by rifles and a cannon. The Klansmen and white supremacists at the Colfax Massacre had a cannon, and they fired the cannon at African Americans who were fleeing this building that had been set on fire. For days, that part of Louisiana was awash in violence, and hundreds of African Americans were murdered. A local militia of African Americans who were called out to suppress the violence were also killed, even though they surrendered to these people they didn't have to surrender to, only because they had the weight of numbers on their side, a cannon, and were willing to use these extra legal means. This is what happened in this country in the Reconstruction period. And it demonstrates again the willingness of whites to use violence to achieve those ends. And later, when there were efforts to arrest the people responsible for the Colfax Massacre, charge them with crimes because they committed mass murder, every one of the whites associated with the Colfax Massacre who were arrested later had their convictions overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court, which not only denied justice to those who were killed and left those murderers off the hook. When the U.S. Supreme Court overturns convictions of people who were rightfully convicted of murder for killing African Americans, it was a green light to white America for decades going forward. If you do this, if you kill African Americans, you won't be punished. So there's so many layers to the Colfax massacre, layers of absolute tragedy. As I've mentioned, Grant in his first term was very successful in warring against the Klan, very successful in using the federal government during radical Reconstruction to force this movement underground. He got Congress to pass the Enforcement Act that really aggrandized his power as president to use the military and other forces of the federal government to outlaw, prosecute, arrest members of the Klan. Grant was a general. He was used to using the military to achieve a goal. He used the military during the Civil War to kill white supremacist Confederates. And now, after the Civil War, he authorized the military to go after the Klan under the Enforcement Act. The Enforcement Act did what is obvious. It declared the Klan a terrorist group, and it authorized this use of force. And by 1871, most of the original iteration of the Klan that had been formed in the late 1860s, certainly during the height of radical Reconstruction, had been extinguished. Leaders of the Klan were arrested and incarcerated. That encouraged low-level members to burn their hoods and disassociate themselves. Again, in his first term, when radical Reconstruction was still prevailing, before the scandals, before the Panic of 1873, before whites in the North turned against radical Reconstruction, when there still was passion and commitment to punish the South, change the South, not let the South off the hook. In that moment of radical Reconstruction, there was a successful effort against the Klan. But in Grant's second term, you have the factors we enunciated at the beginning of this lecture. You have declining support for an interventionist federal government when people saw the Grant administration mired in scandals. You have the Panic of 1873, which is really crucial because Northerners said, look, we've punished the South, we've passed these amendments. Why are we so worried about the South when there's this major economic crisis? We need to use the federal government to achieve the goals of righting the economy, of restoring economic opportunity. And so in Grant's second term, there was less popular support for continuing what is absolutely necessary, federal intervention. It is the federal government who must enforce civil rights. If you leave it up to southern states, you're not going to get equality. So in Grant's second term, when the KKK comes back, there isn't that popular opinion that existed in the radical Reconstruction period for using the federal government to this end. And that's why when Grant leaves office in 1877 and Reconstruction ends, the Klan is back and more than willing to use violence, terrorism to achieve its goals of white supremacy. After the convictions of those involved in the Colfax massacre are overturned, whites feel emboldened. They know they're not going to be punished. And you get decades and decades and decades of violence. The Klan first appeared in Reconstruction, and it appeared at a moment when whites felt that power, political power, was slipping away, and they had to use extra-legal, illegal means outside the law to achieve the goal of win the peace. And when Reconstruction ends in 1877, they had largely achieved that. In Grant's second term, he's unable to marshal public opinion and support for continuing his efforts against the Klan. Whites in the South feel emboldened. There's a major economic crisis that leads to an ebbing of support for maintaining the federal government in the South. And so you have, by the end of Reconstruction, success for the Klan in their campaign of terrorism. But the Klan comes back in its second iteration in the early 20th century. Believe it or not, the heyday for the Ku Klux Klan was in the 1920s. When you think of the 1920s, you might think of flappers, Art Deco, people dancing the Lindy Hop, right? That's kind of our collective image of the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, right? Flappers dancing the Charleston, movie stars, the Roaring 20s. Well, that might be the collective popular image of the 1920s, but the 1920s was a very reactionary period where the Klan comes back now as a force not just in the South but in the North. One of the things that happens in the early 20th century, one of the most important developments in the 20th century, and something that certainly flares during the economy of World War I, the Great Migration. Great Migration refers to this massive exodus of African Americans out of the South to the North to work in northern cities during the wartime economy of World War I. 500,000 African Americans leave the South and head to the North between 1910 and 1920. And when they head to northern cities, race riots break out all over the country, in Chicago, in East St. Louis. Whites in the North do not welcome this large influx of African Americans. And they take to the streets and they beat and kill African Americans who had come to those northern cities seeking economic opportunity. Because, as we talked about in these lectures on Reconstruction, and another key continuity theme in American history is that economic freedom was always central to African Americans' vision of opportunity. That freedom for African Americans, whether it was 40 acres and a mule or later in the Great Migration, was best measured through economic opportunity. In 1963, when you have the March on Washington, Dr. King and A. Philip Randolph marching, the I Have a Dream speech, the slogan for that March on Washington, the summer of 1963, was jobs and freedom. Read the I Have a Dream speech. Don't just listen to clips you might see on YouTube. In that speech, Dr. King is talking about the things that make you free: jobs, housing, education. So, civil rights, freedom for African Americans and racial minorities, Latinos, the efforts of Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta in the 60s, it was always about jobs. It's always about education. It's not just the right to vote. It's not just the right to sit at a lunch counter and order a BLT. Freedom means jobs. And so in the early 20th century, in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, African Americans seeking that notion of freedom head to northern cities. And they're attacked and beaten. And the Klan now set up chapters in the North. They set up chapters in the 1920s in the West. The very first chapters of the Ku Klux Klan, established in the Inland Empire, not too far from campus, were founded in the 1920s by whites who were fearful of African Americans moving to western cities like Los Angeles. A large influx of Filipinos and Latinos who were coming to work in the Inland Empire, in the citrus industry. And so the Klan went nationwide in the 20s, in the North and the West, and they broadened their hate. No longer just targeting African Americans, they targeted immigrants, like Filipinos, like Japanese immigrants. This is what leads to, in 1924, an Immigration Act, the Johnson-Reed Act, that was designed to cut off immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe, when the Klan were instrumental in an anti-immigrant backlash that targeted Jews, Catholics. The Klan targeted labor unions, which they claimed were hotbeds of immigrants and radical ideology. In the reactionary 1920s, where there was this movement against organized labor. They targeted feminists who had emerged in the early 20th century as advocating for the liberation of American women, leading to things like the 19th Amendment and the efforts in the 1920s of the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's the Klan of Reconstruction, which we've examined here, and then there's the Klan of the 20th century that first develops in the 1920s. It was nationwide. It was bipartisan. Democrats and Republicans were members of that Klan of the 1920s. And they targeted not just African Americans who were attempting greater opportunity and freedom in the Great Migration, but Catholics, feminists, immigrants. And it will be that Klan that will take to the streets in the 50s and 60s and kill Emmett Till, kill Medgar Evers, beat upon African Americans who are trying to register to vote. So many continuities here. In our final lectures, we're examining the Reconstruction period, but we're also examining how what happened in Reconstruction, this tragic era, does in many ways set the stage for so many events of the 20th and sadly into the 21st century, as we still live in America where the Klan and white supremacist groups exist. You'll find them now online. You'll find them mobilizing in chat rooms and forums. We saw them in the streets of Charlottesville, marching with tiki torches. So again, in our final lectures, we're examining the final phase of the period under review in this class, Reconstruction, but we're examining it as a tragic era because in this moment, rather than become a nation of equality and freedom for all, we turned our back on those prospects. And violence, terrorism, intimidation played a key role in that, as well as the federal government in Grant's second term not using its coercive power to stop this. And that ultimately explains the tragic era and the way in which what happened in Reconstruction still haunts us to this day.